In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a joyous wedding turns to scandal when Clara Wentworth's cherished sapphire ring vanishes from the altar mid-ceremony. As whispers of suspicion ripple through the church, Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of secrets. Was it the debt-ridden best man, the envious maid of honour, the burdened vicar, or the mysterious guest with a desperate motive? In a tale of betrayal and redemption, Miss Marple's sharp mind reveals the thief, restoring love and trust to a village shaken by deceit. Chapter 1. The Joyous Day. The morning of Clara Wentworth's wedding dawned with a clarity that seemed to bless the village of St. Mary Mead. Sunlight streamed through the ancient yews, casting dappled patterns on the cobblestone path leading to St. Edmund's Church. The air carried the scent of blooming roses. Entwined around the church's arched entrance, their petals trembling in the soft June breeze. Inside, the pews filled with villagers, their Sunday best rustling as they whispered excitedly about the union of Clara, the schoolmaster's daughter, and Thomas Harrow, a solicitor's clerk with a promising future. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the back in her usual unobtrusive spot, adjusted her lace shawl and surveyed the scene with eyes that missed nothing. Clara stood at the altar, her ivory gown glowing in the light filtering through the stained glass windows. Her face, framed by a delicate veil, held a serene joy, though her fingers clutched her bouquet of lilies a touch too tightly. Thomas beside her stood tall, his dark suit impeccable, his smile betraying a nervous pride. Miss Marple noted the faint flush on his cheeks, a sign of a man deeply in love, yet aware of the day's weight. The church hummed with anticipation, the organ's soft prelude weaving through the murmurs. To Clara's left, the maid of honour, Lydia Gray, fussed with the bride's veil, her movements precise, but her smile strained. Lydia, Clara's cousin, was a striking woman with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold a private thought. Miss Marple recalled village talk of Lydia's broken engagement, a scandal hushed up but not forgotten. Her navy dress, though elegant, seemed chosen to avoid outshining the bride, yet her posture suggested a reluctance to fade entirely into the background. At Thomas's side stood the best man, George Knightley, a man whose broad grin and easy charm had won him friends at the village pub. His cuffs, Miss Marple observed, were slightly frayed, and he tugged at them as if conscious of their imperfection. She remembered hearing of his fondness for cards, a habit that had left him in debt to more than one local. His joviality today seemed forced, his eyes darting to the altar where the wedding ring rested. Reverend Hale, the officiant, stood behind the couple, his black robes lending him an air of solemn authority. His face, lined from years of tending his flock, was calm, yet Miss Marple detected a faint distraction in his gaze, as if his thoughts strayed beyond the ceremony. The village knew of the church's crumbling roof, a burden that weighed heavily on the vicar's shoulders. His hands, steady as he opened his prayer book, betrayed no tremor, but Miss Marple wondered what pressures lay beneath his composed exterior. Among the guests, one figure drew her attention. Victor Crane, a man introduced as a distant cousin of the groom. He sat in a middle pew, his thin frame hunched slightly, his eyes flitting about the church. His suit, though clean, was ill-fitting, and his fingers drummed restlessly on the pew. Miss Marple, with her knack for noticing the out-of-place, found his presence curious. Few knew him, and his arrival in St. Mary Mead had been sudden, his explanation vague. She made a mental note of his unease, her fingers smoothing the edge of her prayer book. As the ceremony began, Clara slipped the wedding ring, a simple gold band with a single sapphire, from her finger for the blessing. Reverend Hale placed it on a velvet cushion atop the altar, where it caught the light, sparkling with a quiet promise. The congregation leaned forward, the moment sacred and unbroken. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the ring, then swept across the faces around her, storing each detail like a thread in her tapestry of observation. The organ swelled, and the service continued, but her mind, sharp as ever, sensed the undercurrents beneath the joyous day. Chapter 2. The Vanishing. The interior of St. Edmund's Church, bathed in the soft glow of late morning, seemed to hold its breath as the wedding ceremony of Clara Wentworth and Thomas Harrow reached its pivotal moment. The organ's notes faded into a reverent hush, and the congregation leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the altar where Reverend Hale stood, his prayer book open, his voice steady as he prepared to bless the ring. Clara, her face alight with anticipation, stood beside Thomas, whose hand rested lightly on hers, a gesture of quiet reassurance. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary pew near the back, her lace-gloved hands folded neatly over her prayer book, observed the scene with her usual unobtrusive acuity. Her eyes, bright and unclouded despite her years, flickered across the faces of those nearest the altar, noting each nuance of expression, each subtle shift in posture. Reverend Hale's voice rose, intoning the words of the blessing with a gravity that filled the church. "And now, let us consecrate this ring, a symbol of love and fidelity." His hands moved toward the velvet cushion, where the ring, a gold band set with a single luminous sapphire, had been placed moments earlier by Clara herself. The cushion, adorned with delicate embroidery, sat prominently on the altar, catching the light from a nearby window. The congregation watched, expectant, as the vicar's fingers hovered above it. Then a shadow crossed his face. His hands paused and a faint crease appeared between his brows. He leaned closer, as if doubting his own eyes, and the silence in the church grew taut. "It's gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried like a thunderclap through the stone-walled sanctuary. A gasp rippled through the congregation. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Thomas's face flushed, his jaw tightening as he stepped toward the altar, peering at the empty cushion as if the ring might somehow reappear. The best man, George Knightley, blinked rapidly, his usual joviality replaced by a look of startled confusion. Lydia Gray, the maid of honor, froze, her fingers still clutching a fold of Clara's veil, her lips parting in a silent exclamation. Among the guests, Victor Crane shifted in his pew, his thin frame seeming to shrink further into itself, his eyes darting toward the exit. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind already turning over the implications of this sudden disruption. She noted the reactions around her. The elderly Mrs. Bantry in the front row, clutching her pearls, the village postmistress, Miss Hartnell, whispering urgently to her neighbour, and young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, craning his neck for a better view. The air, once warm with celebration, now crackled with unease. Reverend Hale, recovering his composure, raised his hands for calm. "Please, everyone, remain seated," he said, though his voice betrayed a tremor. There must be some mistake. The ring was here moments ago. He turned to Clara and Thomas, his expression apologetic. "We shall find it. Let us search methodically." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her composure faltering. "It was my grandmother's," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's irreplaceable." Thomas placed an arm around her, his own face a mask of barely contained frustration. "Who could have taken it?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp, his gaze sweeping the faces nearest the altar. George Knightley stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of innocence. "I swear I saw it there during the hymn," he said, his tone earnest but tinged with nervousness. "I was standing right beside Thomas. It was gleaming on the cushion." His eyes flicked to Lydia, as if seeking corroboration, but she remained silent, her face pale, her hands now clasped tightly in front of her. Lydia, when pressed by Thomas's insistent stare, shook her head. "I was adjusting Clara's veil," she said, her voice clipped. "I wasn't looking at the altar. I didn't see anything." Her words were precise, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the faint quiver in her fingers, the way her eyes avoided Clara's. Reverend Hale, his face now flushed with embarrassment, began a cursory search of the altar, lifting the cushion and peering beneath the cloth, as if the ring might have slipped into a fold. "It was here," he muttered, more to himself than to the congregation. "I placed it myself after Clara gave it to me." His hands moved with a hint of desperation, and Miss Marple wondered if his distress stemmed solely from the loss or from some deeper concern. The congregation, no longer content to sit quietly, began to murmur. "It's a scandal," declared Miss Hartnell, her voice carrying over the din. "Stealing a ring during a sacred moment." Mrs. Bantry shushed her, but the sentiment spread, and soon the church was alive with whispered speculations. Miss Marple remained still, her knitting bag at her side, her mind cataloguing the scene with the precision of a village historian. She noted Victor Crane's continued unease, his fingers now drumming a rapid rhythm on his knee, his gaze fixed on the floor as if avoiding scrutiny. Thomas, his patience fraying, turned to the congregation. "Did anyone see anything?" he asked, his voice rising. "Someone must have noticed something." His words were met with shakes of heads and murmured denials, but Miss Marple observed the subtle glances exchanged among the guests. Glances of suspicion, curiosity, and in some cases, fear. Reverend Hale, realizing the ceremony could not proceed without resolution, called for the churchwardens to assist in a search. "We shall check the altar area first," he said, "and then the pews, if necessary. Please, everyone, remain calm." Two elderly churchwardens, Mr. Price and Mr. Ellis, shuffled forward, their faces grave as they began to inspect the altar, lifting candlesticks and peering into corners. The congregation watched, some standing to get a better view, others whispering theories about how a ring could vanish in plain sight. Miss Marple, though outwardly serene, felt a familiar stirring in her mind, the same instinct that had unravelled so many of St. Mary Mead's small mysteries. She recalled a similar incident years ago, when a silver spoon had disappeared during a church fete, only to be found in the pocket of a distracted choir boy. But this was no spoon, and the stakes were higher. A wedding ring steeped in sentiment and tradition was not something one mislaid carelessly. Her eyes moved from the altar to the suspects, each of whom stood within arm's reach of the cushion during the ceremony. George Knightley, she mused, had been closest to Thomas, his role as best man placing him near the altar throughout the service. His nervous energy, so unlike his usual breezy confidence, suggested something amiss. She recalled the village gossip about his gambling debts, the way he'd lingered at the pub, promising to settle his tab soon. Could a man so outwardly loyal to his friend be driven to such a desperate act? Lydia Gray, standing opposite, had been preoccupied with Clara's veil, but her position offered a clear view of the altar. Miss Marple remembered Lydia's sharp words at a recent tea. Her bitterness over her own broken engagement barely veiled. Envy, Miss Marple knew, could twist even the kindest heart. And Lydia's strange smile today hinted at emotions carefully suppressed. Reverend Hale, as the officiant, had handled the ring directly, placing it on the cushion with a reverence that seemed genuine. Yet his distracted air, coupled with the village's whispers about the church's financial woes, raised questions. Miss Marple had seen men of the cloth falter under pressure, their piety no shield against human frailty. And then there was Victor Crane, the outsider, whose presence at the wedding puzzled her. His nervous demeanour, his ill-fitting suit, and his vague connection to the groom marked him as an anomaly. Miss Marple had overheard Mrs. Price, the churchwarden's wife, mention Victor's arrival in the village only days ago, his lodgings taken in haste at the Blue Boar Inn. What brought a man of such evident unease to a wedding where he knew so few? The search of the altar yielded nothing. Mr. Price, holding the cushion aloft, shook his head. "Not a trace," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. Mr. Ellis checked the floor, even crawling beneath the altar, but emerged empty-handed, his knees dusty. Clara's tears spilled over now, and Thomas's arm tightened around her, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and helplessness. "We can't continue without it," Clara said softly, her voice breaking the tense silence. "It's not just a ring, it's a promise." Her words hung in the air, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. She knew the weight of such symbols, the way they anchored love in a world prone to uncertainty. Reverend Hale, his face now ashen, turned to the congregation. "If anyone knows anything, I implore you to speak," he said. "This is a house of truth." His plea was met with silence, though Miss Marple noted the way George's hands clenched, the way Lydia's gaze dropped to her shoes, the way Victor's fingers stilled abruptly, as if caught in a thought he dared not voice. Thomas, unable to contain himself, stepped toward the altar. "Someone here knows something," he said, his voice low but carrying a dangerous edge, "and I'll find out who." His words, though spoken in anger, stirred the congregation further, and the whispers grew into a low hum of accusation. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as the needles in her knitting bag, considered the logistics of the theft. The ring had been visible during the hymn, as George had claimed, and the congregation's attention had been fixed on the hymnals, their voices raised in song. It was a moment of distraction, a perfect opportunity for a quick hand to slip the ring from the cushion. But whose hand? The altar was elevated, accessible only to those at the front. George, Lydia, Reverend Hale, and perhaps a bold guest like Victor, who sat close enough to have moved unnoticed during the hymn's crescendo. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond about the psychology of theft. "People steal for need, for greed, or for spite," he'd said, and Miss Marple had nodded, knowing the truth of it from her years in St. Mary Mead. Need could drive a man like George, his debts a shadow over his charm. Spite might motivate Lydia, her heart bruised by Clara's happiness. Greed, or perhaps desperation, could explain Reverend Hale's distraction, the church's needs pressing heavily on him. And Victor, his motives were less clear, but his unease, suggested a man on the edge of some precipice. The churchwardens, having exhausted their search of the altar, suggested checking the pews, but Reverend Hale hesitated. "We cannot accuse our guests without cause," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The congregation, restless now, began to stand, some offering to help, others exchanging glances of suspicion. Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes moving from face to face, her mind weaving a tapestry of possibilities. Clara, clinging to Thomas, looked toward the back of the church, where Miss Marple sat. Their eyes met, and Miss Marple offered a small, reassuring nod. She knew the girl's distress, the way a single moment could unravel a day meant for joy. She also knew that truth, like a stubborn knot, required patience to untangle. As the congregation dispersed into small groups, some assisting the search, others gossiping in hushed tones, Miss Marple rose quietly, her shawl adjusted with care. She approached Clara, her voice gentle. "My dear," she said, "we shall find your ring. These things have a way of revealing themselves." Clara managed a tearful smile, and Thomas nodded, though his eyes remained hard. Miss Marple returned to her pew, her mind already at work. The ring had not vanished by magic. It had been taken by a human hand, driven by a human motive. She thought of the village, its secrets hidden beneath its placid surface, and knew that the answer lay not in the ring itself, but in the hearts of those who had stood near it. As the church emptied, the mystery deepened, and Miss Marple's resolve hardened. She would watch and listen, and in time the truth would come to light. Chapter 3. The Suspects. The afternoon sun filtered through the vicarage windows, casting long shadows across the parlour where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender polish and old books, and the room, though cosy, bore the faint strain of the morning's upheaval. Reverend Hale had invited Miss Marple for tea, ostensibly to discuss the parish flower rota, but the true purpose was clear. The theft of Clara Wentworth's wedding ring demanded attention, and Miss Marple's reputation for unravelling village mysteries preceded her. The constable, Mr. Slack, a man of brisk efficiency and limited imagination, stood by the hearth, his notebook open, while Clara and Thomas sat stiffly on a faded chintz sofa, their faces etched with worry. The four suspects, George Knightley, Lydia Gray, Reverend Hale himself, and Victor Crane, had been summoned, and their presence filled the room with a palpable tension. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes moving from one face to another, her gentle demeanour masking the sharp calculations beneath. She noted the way Clara's fingers twisted her handkerchief, the way Thomas's jaw clenched when his gaze fell on George, and the way the suspects avoided each other's eyes. The vicarage parlour, with its worn rugs and shelves of theological tomes, seemed an unlikely stage for such drama, yet Miss Marple knew that human nature, with all its frailties, thrived in even the quietest corners of St. Mary Mead. Reverend Hale cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly before him. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice measured but strained, "your insight has often proved invaluable in our little community. This unfortunate incident has cast a shadow over what should have been a joyous day. We hope you might lend your wisdom to the matter." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of mild surprise, though she was not unaccustomed to such requests. "I am but an observer, Reverend," she said, her voice soft yet clear. "But I shall do what I can. Human nature, after all, is much the same whether in a village or a city. Her needles paused, and she looked at Mr. Slack, who seemed impatient to proceed. The constable, a man who preferred facts to feelings, flipped open his notebook. "Right then," he said, his tone brisk. "We've got 4 people who were close enough to the altar to have taken the ring. Mr. Knightley, Miss Grey, Reverend Hale, and Mr. Crane. Let's have their accounts one by one and see where we stand." George Knightley, seated nearest the window, shifted uncomfortably, his broad shoulders hunched. His usual charm, which had won him smiles at village gatherings, seemed dimmed, his eyes shadowed by something Miss Marple could not yet name. "I've already said," he began, his voice a touch too loud. "I saw the ring on the cushion during the hymn. I was standing by Thomas, holding the prayer book. I didn't touch it." He glanced at Thomas as if seeking support, but Thomas's expression remained hard. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her eyes fixed on George. She recalled the whispers about his late nights at the Red Lion, where he'd been seen scribbling IOUs on napkins. His father, old Mr. Knightley, had been a man of thrift. But George, she knew, had a taste for risk. "Mr. Knightley," she said gently, "you were very near the altar. Did you notice anyone else approach it during the hymn?" George's eyes widened, then narrowed. "No, I was focused on the service," he said, but his fingers tugged at his cuff, betraying a flicker of unease. Miss Marple noted it, her mind filing away the gesture like a stitch in her pattern. Lydia Gray sat across from George, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her navy dress, though elegant, seemed to weigh on her, as if chosen to suppress rather than enhance her natural grace. When Mr. Slack turned to her, she lifted her chin, her voice cool. "I was attending to Clara's veil," she said. "It had slipped during the hymn, and I was ensuring it stayed in place. I had no reason to look at the altar, let alone touch anything on it." Her words were precise, but her eyes flicked briefly to Clara. And Miss Marple caught a glint of something, resentment perhaps, or regret. Clara, sitting beside Thomas, flinched at Lydia's tone, and Miss Marple remembered their childhood, when the cousins had been inseparable, their laughter echoing through the village green. But time, and perhaps envy, had strained their bond. Lydia's broken engagement, Miss Marple recalled, had been the talk of the village tea-rooms, with whispers of a rival who had turned the fiancé's head. Could such a wound fester into something darker? Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts weaving. Reverend Hale, though a suspect, took his turn with a quiet dignity, his hands resting on the arms of his chair. "I placed the ring on the cushion myself," he said, his voice steady but soft. "Clara handed it to me before the blessing, and I set it there, as is customary. I cannot explain its disappearance." His eyes met Miss Marple's, and she saw in them a weariness that went beyond the morning's events. The village knew of the church's struggles, the roof leaking during spring rains, the organ in need of repair. Reverend Hale's sermons, once full of vigour, had lately carried a note of strain. Miss Marple wondered if the weight of duty could push even a man of faith to an act of desperation. Victor Crane, the last to speak, sat apart from the others, his thin frame slouched in a corner chair. His eyes, dark and restless, darted toward the door, as if he longed to escape the room's scrutiny. "I was just a guest," he said, his voice low, almost sullen. "I sat in the pews, nowhere near the altar. I didn't see anything, and I certainly didn't take anything." His words were clipped, and he crossed his arms, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against his sleeve. Miss Marple studied him, her mind turning over the village's sparse knowledge of the man. Victor Crane, a draper from London, had arrived claiming a distant kinship to Thomas, though few could verify it. His lodgings at the Blue Boar Inn had been taken in haste, and his manner, she noted, was that of a man carrying a burden. She recalled Mrs. Price's remark about his late-night pacing, his suitcase bulging with papers. "Mr. Crane," she said, her tone mild, "you seemed quite attentive during the ceremony. Did nothing catch your eye?" Victor's mouth tightened, and he shook his head. "I was watching the service, like everyone else," he said, but his voice held a defensive edge. And Miss Marple noted the way his fingers stilled, as if conscious of her gaze. Mr. Slack, growing impatient, closed his notebook with a snap. "Well, we're no closer to answers," he said. "The ring didn't walk off on its own. Someone took it, and I'll be questioning everyone again tomorrow. In the meantime, no one leaves the village." His eyes lingered on Victor, whose outsider status made him an easy target, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust such assumptions. Clara, her voice trembling, spoke up. "Miss Marple, you've helped before. Can't you do something?" Her eyes, red from tears, held a desperate hope, and Thomas nodded, his arm around her shoulders. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression one of quiet resolve. "I shall observe, my dear," she said. "People reveal themselves in the smallest ways. A glance, a word, a hesitation. We shall see what comes to light." Her words were gentle, but her mind was already at work, sifting through the morning's events, the suspect's behaviours, the undercurrents of motive. Reverend Hale offered more tea, but the gathering dispersed, each suspect retreating with their own thoughts. George lingered by the window, his face troubled. Lydia left quickly, her head bowed. Victor slipped out with a muttered excuse, his steps hurried. Reverend Hale remained, his hands clasped as if in prayer, though his eyes betrayed a deeper worry. Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, her shawl drawn against the evening chill. The village, bathed in the golden light of dusk, seemed peaceful, but she knew its calm was deceptive. She thought of her garden, where weeds could hide among the roses, and of human nature, where greed, envy, or need could lurk beneath a polite facade. The ring, she was certain, was still in St. Mary Mead, and its thief was among those she had seen today. As she reached her gate, her needles tucked safely in her bag, she resolved to listen, to watch, and to let the truth unravel in its own time. Chapter 4. The Best Man's Tale. The following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead stirred under a sky heavy with the promise of rain. The air carried a damp chill, and the cobblestones glistened with dew as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village hall, where Constable Slack had set up a makeshift office to continue his inquiries into the theft of Clara Wentworth's wedding ring. The hall, usually reserved for whist drives and parish meetings, now held an air of solemnity, its long windows admitting a muted light that fell on the wooden table where George Knightley sat, his hands clasped tightly before him. Miss Marple, invited by the constable to lend her quiet observation, settled into a chair near the back, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes keen beneath the brim of her modest hat. George, the best man, was the first to be questioned that day, his broad frame seeming out of place in the narrow chair. His face, usually quick with a smile, was drawn, and his eyes darted toward the constable, who stood with his notebook open, his expression one of determined skepticism. Thomas Harrow, present at Clara's insistence, stood by the door, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on his old friend with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant loyalty. Clara, seated beside Miss Marple, clutched a damp handkerchief, her eyes red but resolute. Constable Slack began with a bluntness that Miss Marple found predictable. "Mr. Knightley," he said, his voice carrying a hint of accusation. "You were standing closest to the altar when the ring went missing. You said yesterday you saw it during the hymn, but no one else can confirm that. Care to explain yourself?" George's hands tightened, his knuckles whitening. "I've told you," he said, his voice strained but firm. "I saw the ring on the cushion. It was there, gleaming, when we sang Love Divine. I was holding the prayer book for Thomas, standing right beside him. I didn't touch the thing." His eyes flicked to Thomas, seeking support, but Thomas's expression remained guarded. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, the rhythm steady as she observed George's posture, the slight hunch of his shoulders, the way his left hand tugged at his cuff, a habit she had noted the previous day. She recalled the village's tales of George's charm, his easy laughter at the Red Lion, where he'd often regaled the locals with stories of his school days with Thomas. But she also remembered the whispers of his gambling, the IOUs left unpaid, the way his father's modest inheritance had dwindled. Debt, she knew, could make a man reckless, even one as genial as George. "Did you step away at any point?" Constable Slack pressed, leaning forward. "Witnesses say you left the church briefly before the ceremony. Where were you?" George's face flushed, and he shifted in his seat. "I went out for a cigarette," he said, "just for a minute, before the service started. I was back in time to walk down the aisle with Thomas. Ask anyone." His tone was defiant, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers trembled slightly, as if struggling to maintain his composure. Constable Slack scribbled in his notebook, his lips pursed. "A cigarette, you say? Convenient. And you didn't see anyone near the altar when you returned?" "No," George said quickly. Too quickly, Miss Marple thought. Everyone was in their places. Clara, Lydia, the vicar. The ring was still there when I came back. I'm sure of it. He glanced at Clara, his expression softening. "I'd never ruin your day, Clara. You know that." Clara's lips trembled, but she said nothing, her eyes dropping to her lap. Thomas, however, stepped forward, his voice low and sharp. "You've been in trouble before, George," he said. "Those debts of yours, everyone knows about them. Did you think the ring could clear your slate?" George's head snapped up, his eyes wide with indignation. "That's unfair, Tom," he said, his voice rising. "I'd never steal from you or Clara. We've been friends since we were boys." His words carried a raw sincerity, but Miss Marple noted the desperation beneath them, the way his hands clenched as if to anchor himself against the accusation. Constable Slack raised a hand to quiet the exchange. "Enough," he said. "Mr. Knightley, you're not helping yourself with these outbursts. If you've nothing more to add, we'll move on." He glanced at Miss Marple, as if hoping for her input, but she merely smiled, her needles continuing their steady work. She spoke at last, her voice gentle but precise. "Mr. Knightley," she said, "you mentioned the hymn. It's a curious thing, isn't it, how a moment of song can distract us all? Everyone standing, singing, their eyes on their hymnals, or perhaps not. Her tone was mild, but her words carried a weight that made George pause, his brow furrowing. I suppose so, he said, his voice faltering. But I didn't see anything unusual. I was singing, same as everyone else. He looked away, his fingers once again tugging at his cuff. And Miss Marple made a mental note of his discomfort, like a dropped stitch in her knitting. She thought of her nephew Raymond's tales of London card games, where men like George, charming and reckless, could lose fortunes in a single night. She recalled, too, a conversation with Mrs. Price, the churchwarden's wife, who had mentioned George's recent visit to the post office, sending a hurried letter to a bookmaker in London. People in debt, she mused to herself, often act out of character, especially when they see a way out. But was George desperate enough to betray his friend? The thought lingered, unresolved. Constable Slack, growing impatient, dismissed George with a curt nod. "Stay in the village," he said. "We'll need to speak with you again." George rose, his movements stiff, and left the hall, casting a final glance at Thomas, who turned away. As the door closed behind him, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's always been kind to us," she said, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple. "But he's changed lately, I've seen it. He's been so on edge." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "People do change, my dear," she said. "Sometimes it's the weight of their choices, sometimes something else. We shall see." Her words were comforting, but her mind was already turning to the next suspect, Lydia Gray, whose cool demeanour and hidden wounds intrigued her just as much. The hall grew quiet, the only sound the patter of rain beginning to fall outside, and Miss Marple's needles clicked on, weaving her thoughts into a pattern that would, in time, reveal the truth. Chapter 5. The Maid of Honour's Secret. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle. By the time Miss Jane Marple reached the Duprou village hall again the following morning, her umbrella bobbing above her as she navigated the slick cobblestones of St. Mary Mead. The hall, still serving as Constable Slack's temporary headquarters, smelled faintly of damp wool and paraffin, its high ceilings echoing with the low murmur of voices. Inside, Lydia Gray sat at the wooden table, her posture as rigid as a porcelain figurine, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her navy dress, pressed to perfection, seemed to armour her against the scrutiny of the room, yet her eyes, sharp and guarded, betrayed a flicker of unease. Miss Marple, settling into her usual chair near the back, adjusted her shawl and opened her knitting bag, her needles soon resuming their familiar rhythm. Clara and Thomas were absent today, their presence deemed unnecessary by the constable, but Miss Marple felt their absence keenly, knowing the weight of the stolen ring pressed heaviest on them. Constable Slack stood before Lydia, his notebook open, his expression one of barely concealed impatience. "Miss Gray," he began, his voice clipped, "you were at the bride's side during the ceremony, fussing with her veil, by your own account. That put you as close to the altar as anyone. What did you see?" Lydia's lips parted slightly, then closed, as if measuring her words with care. "I've told you," she said, her voice cool and even. "I was attending to Clara. Her veil had caught on a pin, and I was ensuring it stayed in place. My attention was on her, not the altar." Her fingers clasped in her lap twitched faintly, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, like a thread pulled too tight in a delicate stitch. Slack's eyes narrowed. "You didn't glance at the ring?" "Not once. It was right there, sparkling on the cushion." His tone carried a hint of disbelief. and he leaned forward, his pencil poised over his notebook. Lydia's chin lifted, her expression defiant. "I had no reason to look at it," she said. "My duty was to Clara, not to some piece of jewellery." Her words were sharp, almost cutting, and Miss Marple caught the faint flush that rose to her cheeks. A sign of emotion held tightly in check. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes resting on Lydia with a gentle curiosity. She recalled the village's tales of Lydia Gray, Clara's cousin, who had once been the brighter star of the pair. Vivacious, sought after, the belle of every village dance. But that light had dimmed with the collapse of her engagement to a young barrister from London, a man who, according to the tea-room gossip, had been swayed by another's charms. The scandal had left Lydia quieter, her laughter rarer, her eyes often shadowed by a private pain. Miss Marple had seen her walking alone at dusk, her face pale and drawn, as if nursing a wound that refused to heal. "You were standing so close, Miss Gray," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the constable's brusqueness. "It's a curious thing, isn't it, how our eyes can wander, even when we're busy. A glance at the altar, perhaps, during a lull in the hymn." Her tone was kind, almost conversational, but her words carried a subtle probe, like a needle testing a seam. Lydia's gaze flicked to Miss Marple, a spark of irritation in her eyes before it was quickly masked. "I didn't look," she said, her voice firmer now. "I was focused on Clara. She was nervous, and I wanted her to look perfect." Her fingers tightened, the knuckles whitening, and Miss Marple noted the way her shoulders stiffened, as if bracing against an unseen weight. Constable Slack, undeterred, pressed on. "You've known Miss Wentworth a long time, haven't you? Cousins, practically sisters. Must have stung seeing her so happy when your own engagement fell apart." His words were blunt, and Miss Marple winced inwardly at his lack of tact, though she could not fault his logic. Lydia's face paled, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That's hardly relevant," she said, her voice icy. "Clara's happiness means everything to me. I'd never do anything to hurt her." Her words were resolute, but her eyes dropped to her lap, and Miss Marple caught the brief tremble of her lower lip, a crack in her carefully constructed facade. She thought of her friend Dolly Bantry, who had once remarked on Lydia's pride, the way she'd held her head high even after the village buzzed with her misfortune. "Pride," Dolly had said, "can be a dangerous thing when it's wounded." Miss Marple had nodded, knowing how envy, even in a heart as loyal as Lydia's, could twist into something darker. She recalled, too, a moment at the church, when Lydia's hand had lingered on Clara's veil, her touch almost possessive, her smile tight with something unspoken. "Did you speak with anyone during the ceremony?" Miss Marple asked, her tone still gentle, as if merely curious. "A word with the vicar, perhaps, or a glance at Mr. Knightley. It's such a small space, the altar, and so many eyes upon it." Lydia shook her head, her movements brisk. "I spoke to no one," she said. "I was too busy with Clara. I didn't notice anything else." Her voice was steady, but her fingers twisted the edge of her sleeve, a small betrayal of her calm. Constable Slack scribbled in his notebook, his frustration evident. "You're not giving us much, Miss Gray," he said. "Someone took that ring, and you were right there. If you're hiding something, it'll come out sooner or later." He snapped his notebook shut, signalling the end of the questioning, but his eyes lingered on Lydia, as if expecting her to crack under his stare. Lydia rose, her movements graceful but deliberate, and left the hall without another word, her head held high. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over the young woman's demeanour. Envy, she knew, was a quiet poison, seeping into the heart unnoticed until it spurred action. She thought of her niece Mabel, whose jealousy of her cousin's new dress had once led to a torn hem, a small act of spite that revealed a deeper hurt. Could Lydia, wounded by her own loss, have seen Clara's ring as a symbol of all she lacked? As the hall emptied, Miss Marple remained, her needles clicking in the silence. She thought of the altar, the ring gleaming on its cushion, and the brief moment of distraction during the hymn when all eyes were turned away. Lydia's role as maid of honour had kept her close, her hands busy, but her heart, perhaps, was elsewhere. Miss Marple's mind wove the threads together. Not yet a pattern, but a sense of something hidden, waiting to be unravelled. She rose, her shawl adjusted with care, and stepped into the rain, her thoughts as steady as the drizzle that fell on St. Mary Mead. The truth, she knew, lay in the small things, the glance, the gesture, the unspoken wound, and she would watch, as always, until it revealed itself. Chapter 6. The Officiant's Burden. The drizzle of the previous day had given way to a heavy mist that clung to St. Mary Mead, shrouding the village in a damp veil, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the vicarage. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke, and the church spire loomed faintly through the haze, a silent sentinel over the village's unease. The theft of Clara Wentworth's wedding ring had cast a pall over St. Edmund's, and Miss Marple, invited by Reverend Hale under the guise of discussing the church flower arrangements, knew the true purpose of her visit lay in the questions that hung unanswered. Her umbrella tilted against the mist. She stepped carefully along the path, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, her mind as sharp as the needles within. The vicarage parlour was warm but subdued, its familiar clutter of books and faded cushions offering little comfort today. Reverend Hale stood by the window, his black clerical attire stark against the pale light, his hands clasped behind his back as if in prayer. His face, lined with the weight of his duties, carried a weariness that Miss Marple noted at once, though his smile was kind as he greeted her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice soft but strained, "your presence is always a balm. I thought we might discuss the roses for Sunday, but, well, you know why you're here." Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her shawl draped neatly over her knees, her needles emerging from her bag with a practised ease. "Indeed, Reverend," she said, her tone gentle, but with a hint of purpose. "Flowers are a lovely subject, but I suspect the ring is on your mind. A troubling matter, to be sure." Her eyes met his, and she saw a flicker of unease, quickly masked by his usual composure. Constable Slack had not joined them, detained by a minor incident at the village shop, but his absence suited Miss Marple, who preferred to observe without his brusque interruptions. Reverend Hale, though not formally questioned today, had agreed to speak with her, his role as officiant placing him under scrutiny. He sat across from her, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, his fingers tracing the worn fabric as if seeking solace in its familiarity. "I handled the ring myself," he began unprompted, his voice steady but low. "Clara gave it to me before the blessing, and I placed it on the cushion, as I've done for countless weddings. It was there, Miss Marple, gleaming in the light. I cannot fathom how it vanished." His eyes drifted to the window, where the mist swirled, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his voice, a crack in his usual serenity. She nodded, her needles clicking softly, the rhythm a counterpoint to the tension in the room. "It's a curious thing, Reverend," she said, "how such a small object can disappear in a moment of reverence. You were at the altar throughout the ceremony, were you not? Your view must have been clear." Reverend Hale's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward slightly. "I was there," he said, "but my attention was on the service. The words, the prayer book, the couple. During the hymn, I stepped back to let the congregation sing, my eyes on my notes. I didn't think to watch the ring." His hands clasped tightly, and Miss Marple observed the way his thumbs pressed together, a gesture of restraint. She thought of the village's respect for Reverend Hale, a man whose sermons, though lately tinged with fatigue, had long inspired St. Mary Mead. But she also recalled the whispers at the Women's Institute, where Mrs. Price had mentioned the church's mounting debts, the roof in dire need of repair, the organ wheezing through every hymn. The collection plate, once generous, had grown lighter as the village faced its own struggles. Miss Marple had seen such pressures before, in her friend Mr. Clement, whose rectory had once faced similar straits. A man of faith, she mused, is not immune to the temptations of necessity. "You've carried a heavy burden, Reverend," she said, her voice soft but probing. "The church's needs are no secret. It must weigh on you, keeping St. Edmund's afloat." Her words were kind, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any sign of discomfort. Reverend Hale's face tightened, and he looked down at his hands. "It's true," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The repairs are costly, and the diocese offers little help, but I would never take something so sacred as a wedding ring." His eyes met hers, earnest but clouded, and Miss Marple saw in them a man wrestling with his own doubts, if not his guilt. She nodded, her needles pausing briefly. "Of course, Reverend," she said, "but it's human nature, isn't it, to feel the strain of duty? A moment's lapse, a fleeting thought. It happens to us all." Her tone was sympathetic, but her words carried a subtle challenge, inviting him to reveal more. He shook his head, his expression resolute. "I took nothing, Miss Marple. I swear it before God." His voice was firm, but his hands trembled slightly, and Miss Marple noted the way his gaze flickered to the corner of the room, where a stack of unpaid bills lay half-hidden beneath a prayer book. She thought of her nephew Raymond's tales of men driven to extremes by financial ruin, their principles bending under the weight of obligation. She recalled, too, a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a church warden, pressed by debts, had borrowed from the collection plate, intending to repay it before anyone noticed. Could Reverend Hale, so steadfast in his calling, have succumbed to a similar temptation? The ring, small but valuable, could ease a pressing debt, if only for a time. "During the hymn," she said, her voice as gentle as a breeze, "the congregation was standing, their eyes on their hymnals. A moment of distraction, perhaps, for everyone. Did you notice anyone near the altar? Mr. Knightley, perhaps, or Miss Grey?" Reverend Hale frowned, his memory strained. I can't say," he said. "George was to my right, Lydia to my left, but I was focused on the service. I didn't see them move, but then I wasn't watching closely." His voice faltered, and Miss Marple sensed his frustration, not just with the theft, but with his own inability to provide answers. She nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. And Mr. Crane, the guest, she said, almost as an afterthought. He was seated nearby, wasn't he? An unfamiliar face can stand out, even in a crowd. Reverend Hale's brow creased. Victor Crane? Yes, he was in the third pew, I believe. I noticed him because he seemed out of place. Restless, perhaps, but I didn't see him approach the altar. His words were careful, and Miss Marple noted the hesitation, as if he feared to accuse without cause. She thought of the vicarage itself, its modest comforts masking a quiet struggle. The unpaid bills, the worn furniture, the faint smell of damp in the corners, all spoke of a man stretched thin by duty. Yet Reverend Hale's sincerity, his evident distress, suggested a heart more burdened than deceitful. Miss Marple's mind turned over the possibilities, her thoughts like threads waiting to be woven into a pattern. As she rose to leave, her shawl adjusted with care, she offered a small smile. "Thank you, Reverend," she said. "You've been most helpful. These things, you know, have a way of coming clear in time." Her words were comforting, but her eyes held a quiet resolve. Already shifting to the next thread in the mystery. Outside, the mist had thickened, cloaking St. Mary Mead in a hush that seemed to mirror the village's unease. Miss Marple walked home, her umbrella a shield against the damp, her mind sifting through the morning's conversation. Reverend Hale's burden, she knew, was not just the church's, but something deeper, something personal. Whether it led to theft, she could not yet say, but the truth, like the mist, would eventually lift, revealing what lay beneath it. Chapter 7. The Mysterious Guest. The mist that had cloaked St. Mary Mead for days began to lift by noon, leaving the village bathed in a pale, uncertain light. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the lingering damp, made her way along the high street, her sturdy shoes tapping lightly on the cobblestones. Her destination was the Blue Boar Inn, where Victor Crane, the enigmatic guest at Clara Wentworth's wedding, had taken lodgings. The theft of the wedding ring remained unresolved, and Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing the quiet currents of village life, drew her to this stranger whose presence at the ceremony had seemed so incongruous. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, a familiar companion, though her mind was far from the skein of wool within. The Blue Boar, a modest establishment with a sagging roof and ivy-clad walls, bustled with the subdued energy of midday. The innkeeper, Mrs. Lumley, a stout woman with a sharp eye for gossip, greeted Miss Marple with a nod and a knowing smile. "Come about Mr. Crane, have you?" she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's in the parlour, though he keeps to himself, that one. Not a word more than necessary." Miss Marple's lips curved in a polite smile. "Just a small matter," she said, her voice soft but purposeful. "I thought I might have a word with him, if he's not too busy." She followed Mrs. Lumley to the parlour, a small room with heavy oak furniture and a fire crackling in the hearth. Victor Crane sat alone at a corner table, his thin frame hunched over a cup of tea, his eyes fixed on a newspaper that seemed to hold little of his attention. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his dark eyes narrowing briefly before he forced a smile. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, his voice low and cautious. "I've heard you're quite the figure in the village. To what do I owe the visit?" His fingers, long and restless, tapped the edge of the table, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor, a sign of nerves, or perhaps something more. She settled into a chair across from him, her knitting bag placed carefully at her feet. "Oh, nothing formal, Mr. Crane," she said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. I was passing by and thought it only neighbourly to make your acquaintance. You're new to St. Mary Mead, and we do like to welcome visitors." Her needles emerged, their clicking a soft counterpoint to the crackle of the fire, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Victor's smile faltered, and he leaned back, his arms crossing defensively. "Kind of you," he said, "but I'm only here for a short while. Family business, you might say." His words were clipped, and Miss Marple caught the way his gaze flicked to the door, as if measuring the distance to an escape. She nodded, her needles moving steadily. "Family business," she repeated, her voice thoughtful. "You're a cousin of Mr. Harrow's, I understand. A distant connection, perhaps, but it's kind of you to attend the wedding on such short notice." Her tone was conversational, but her words carried a subtle probe, testing the edges of his story. Victor's fingers stilled, and he shrugged. "Distant, yes," he said. "Thomas's mother and mine were cousins or some such. I thought it right to be there." His voice was casual, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes avoided hers. She thought of the village's sparse knowledge of Victor Crane, pieced together from fragments of gossip. Mrs. Lumley had mentioned his late arrival, his suitcase stuffed with papers, and his habit of pacing the inn's garden at odd hours. The postmistress, Miss Hartnell, had whispered of urgent letters sent to London, their envelopes marked with the name of a pawnbroker. Victor's trade as a draper, Miss System, Marple recalled, was said to be faltering, his shop in London teetering on the edge of ruin. A man in such straits, she knew, might see a valuable ring as a lifeline, however fleeting. "You must find our little village quite different from London," Miss Marple continued, her voice mild. "So quiet, yet full of small moments that catch the eye. The wedding, for instance, such a lovely ceremony until the ring went missing. You were seated quite near the altar, weren't you? A good view of everything." Her needles paused, her eyes meeting his with a gentle curiosity that belied their sharpness. Victor's face tightened, and he shifted in his seat. "I was in the third pew," he said, his tone defensive. "I saw nothing but the service. People standing, singing, the usual thing. I wasn't watching the altar." His fingers resumed their tapping, a rapid rhythm that betrayed his unease, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to the window, as if seeking relief from her gaze. She nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Of course," she said. "It's easy to miss things in a crowd, isn't it? All those voices raised in song, all those eyes turned elsewhere. A moment's distraction is all it takes." Her words were soft, almost musing, but they carried a weight that made Victor's shoulders stiffen. "I didn't see anything," he said, his voice sharper now. "I was just a guest, Miss Marple. I had no business with the ring." He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table, and Miss Marple observed the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, a detail that spoke louder than his words. She thought of her friend Dolly Bantry's tales of desperate men, their lives unravelling under the weight of debt. "Desperation," Dolly had once said, "makes people do things they'd never dream of otherwise." Miss Marple had seen it in St. Mary Mead before. A farmer pocketing a neighbour's tools to sell, a maid slipping a silver spoon into her apron, each act born of a need too pressing to ignore. Victor's restless demeanour, his vague explanations, suggested a man on the edge, his life a tangle of unpaid bills and broken promises. "Did you know anyone else at the wedding?" she asked, her tone still light, as if making small talk. Mr. Knightley, perhaps, or Miss Grey? It's such a small village, one often finds connections. Victor shook his head, his movements brisk. No one, he said. I came for Thomas, that's all. I kept to myself. His voice was curt, and he stood abruptly, as if eager to end the conversation. If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have some matters to attend to. She rose with a grace that belied her years, her shawl adjusted with care. Of course, Mr. Crane, she said, her smile warm but her eyes unyielding. I shan't keep you, but do take care. St. Mary Mead has a way of noticing things, even the smallest details. Her words hung in the air, and she saw a flicker of alarm in his eyes before he nodded and hurried from the parlour. As Miss Marple stepped back into the village street, the light now breaking through the clouds, she reflected on Victor Crane's unease. His story, thin as it was, held gaps that intrigued her, gaps that spoke of secrets, perhaps of desperation. She thought of the ring, its sapphire catching the light on the altar, and the fleeting moment when it vanished. Victor's seat in the third pew, close enough to move unnoticed during the hymn, placed him within reach of opportunity. But opportunity, she knew, required motive. And Victor's nervous glances suggested a man with much to hide. Her needles tucked safely in her bag, Miss Marple walked toward her cottage, her mind weaving the threads of the mystery. Victor Crane, the outsider, was a puzzle piece that did not yet fit, but she was certain that with time and observation, the pattern would emerge as clear as the roses in her garden. Chapter 8. The Village Whispers. The sun broke through the clouds by mid-afternoon, casting a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, and drying the last traces of the morning's mist. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, strolled along the village high street, her eyes taking in the familiar sights. The butcher's shop with its gleaming window, the post office with its queue of gossips, the bakery wafting the scent of fresh scones. Her knitting bag hung at her side, a quiet companion, but her true purpose was to listen, to gather the threads of village talk that might unravel the mystery of Clara Wentworth's stolen wedding ring. The village, she knew, was a tapestry of whispers, each snippet of conversation a stitch that could reveal the pattern of truth. Her first stop was the post office, where Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, presided with a sharp tongue and an even sharper memory. The small room buzzed with the chatter of villagers collecting their letters, and Miss Marple, stepping inside, was greeted with nods and murmured pleasantries. She approached the counter under the pretense of buying stamps, her smile as disarming as ever. "Good day, Miss Hartnell," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Such a to-do about the wedding, isn't it? Poor Clara, losing her grandmother's ring like that." Her needles emerged from her bag, clicking gently as she stood, her eyes bright with interest. Miss Hartnell's lips pursed, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of scandal. "A disgrace, Miss Marple," she said, leaning forward. "Stealing in a church, no less. I saw that Mr. Crane, the stranger, sending letters to London just days ago. Urgent ones, mind you, addressed to a pawnbroker. Shifty sort, if you ask me." She lowered her voice, glancing at the other customers. "And he was at the wedding, sitting close to the altar, wasn't he?" Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily. "Indeed," she said, her tone thoughtful. "A pawnbroker, you say? That's curious." She filed away the detail, recalling Victor Crane's nervous demeanour at the Blue Boar. A man corresponding with pawnbrokers, she mused, might well see a sapphire ring as a solution to pressing debts. As she left the post office, her stamps tucked into her bag, Miss Marple turned toward the bakery, where Mrs. Baker, a plump woman with flour-dusted hands, was arranging a tray of buns. The shop was warm and fragrant, and Mrs. Baker greeted Miss Marple with a smile, though her eyes held a spark of curiosity. "Heard about the ring, have you?" she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Terrible business. I saw Miss Gray in here the other day, buying a single loaf, looking all pinched and sour. She was muttering about Clara's perfect life. Not that I was eavesdropping, mind." Miss Marple's lips curved in a gentle smile. "Of course not," she said, "but it's natural to notice things, isn't it? Miss Gray has had her share of troubles, poor girl." She thought of Lydia's tight smile at the wedding, her hands fussing with Clara's veil, and the bitterness that seemed to linger beneath her composure. Envy, Miss Marple knew, could fester in a heart wounded by loss, and Lydia's broken engagement was a wound still raw. Her next stop was the Red Lion, where the landlord, Mr. Higgs, polished glasses behind the bar. The pub was quiet at this hour, its dark beams and worn tables a haven for village secrets. Miss Marple, under the guise of inquiring about a charity raffle, eased into conversation. "Such a pity about the wedding," she said, her voice soft. "Mr. Knightley must be dreadfully upset, being so close to the altar when the ring vanished." Mr. Higgs snorted, setting down a glass with a thud. "George Knightley's upset, all right, but not just about the ring," he said. "Owes me a tidy sum, he does. Been promising to pay for weeks, always with that grin of his. I heard him, boasting about a big win coming soon, but I'll believe it when I see it." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "He was in here the night before the wedding, scribbling notes to some bookmaker in London. Looked desperate, if you ask me." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind turning over the landlord's words. George's gambling debts were no secret, but the timing of his boasts intrigued her. A man expecting a windfall, she thought, might take a reckless chance, especially if he stood near a valuable ring during a moment of distraction. Her final stop was the church, where Mr. Ellis, the churchwarden, was sweeping the steps. His face, weathered by years of service, lit up at the sight of Miss Marple. "Come to pray for answers, have you?" he said, his tone half-joking. "That ring business has us all in a tizzy." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes scanning the churchyard. "I do hope for answers, Mr. Ellis," she said. "Reverend Hale seems particularly troubled. The church's burdens must weigh heavily on him." Mr. Ellis nodded, leaning on his broom. "Oh, aye. He's been begging for donations, you know. Roof's leaking worse than ever. I saw him sorting through bills in the vestry, looking like he hadn't slept in days. A man like that, well, he might do something out of character, mightn't he?" His voice was hesitant, as if reluctant to accuse, but Miss Marple caught the implication. She thanked him and walked home, her mind weaving the threads of gossip into a pattern. Victor Crane's letters to a pawnbroker suggested a man in financial straits. His presence at the wedding perhaps more calculated than he admitted. Lydia Gray's bitterness, voiced in the bakery, hinted at a heart stung by Clara's joy. George Knightley's debts, coupled with his boasts of a coming windfall, painted a picture of desperation. And Reverend Hale, burdened by the church's needs, carried a weariness that could mask a moment of weakness. As she reached her cottage, the roses in her garden nodding in the breeze, Miss Marple paused, her knitting bag heavy at her side. The village's whispers, like her stitches, were forming a shape, not yet complete but growing clearer. The ring, she was certain, was still in St. Mary Mead, and its thief was among those whose secrets she had heard. She would listen and watch and let the pattern emerge in its own time. Chapter 9. The Pawnshop Clue. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the parlour floor as she sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking with their usual steady rhythm. The village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet beyond her garden, but the air held a tension, as if the theft of Clara Wentworth's wedding ring had stirred the very stones into whispering suspicion. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the needles in her hands, turned over the fragments of gossip she had gathered, each piece a thread in the tapestry of the mystery. The suspects, George Knightley, Lydia Gray, Reverend Hale, and Victor Crane, each carried their own burdens. But it was Victor, the outsider, whose restless demeanour and vague explanations drew her attention most keenly today. The morning had brought a new lead, one that Miss Marple had pursued with the quiet determination that so often surprised those who underestimated her. Over breakfast, she had telephoned her old friend Mrs. Bantry, whose cousin in London knew a reputable pawnbroker, Mr. Goldstein, whose shop was known to villagers for its discreet handling of valuables. Miss Hartnell's mention of Victor Crane's urgent letters to a pawnbroker had not escaped Miss Marple's notice, and with Constable Slack's reluctant permission, she had made inquiries. The response, delivered by a crackling telephone line, was a thread she could not ignore. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and reached for her notepad, where she had jotted down the details. Mr. Goldstein had confirmed that a man matching Victor Crane's description, thin, dark-eyed, with a nervous air, had visited his shop that very morning, offering a gold ring set with a single sapphire. The ring, described in precise detail, matched Clara's, a simple band, slightly worn, with a gem that caught the light like a drop of sky. Mr. Goldstein, wary of the man's haste and lack of provenance, had refused the sale, noting the initial CW engraved inside the band. The man had left abruptly, his face pale, and Mr. Goldstein had thought no more of it until Miss Marple's call. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she considered this revelation. A desperate man is a careless one, she murmured to herself, her mind turning over Victor's behaviour at the Blue Boar Inn. His fidgeting hands, his evasive answers, his hurried departure. The pawnbroker's account placed the ring in his possession, a damning thread that tightened the net around him. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. The truth, like her knitting, required patience to weave correctly. Rising, she donned her hat and shawl, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, and made her way to the village hall, where Constable Slack had agreed to meet her. The hall was quieter today, its wooden benches empty save for a young clerk sorting papers. Slack, pacing by the table, greeted her with a nod, his expression a mix of frustration and grudging respect. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope this pawnbroker business isn't a wild goose chase. I've got enough on my plate without chasing London rumours." Miss Marple smiled, her demeanour as gentle as ever. "Not a rumour, Mr. Slack," she said, producing her notepad. "Mr. Goldstein is a man of reputation, and his description of the ring and the man who offered it is quite specific. I believe we should speak with Mr. Crane again, don't you?" Her voice was mild, but her eyes held a quiet authority that made Slack pause. he grunted, flipping open his notebook. "Right then, I'll send for Crane. But if he's got the ring, why hasn't he sold it yet? And why try a London shop so soon after the theft? Sounds like a fool's errand to me." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she settled into a chair, her thoughts weaving. "Desperation, Mr. Slack," she said, "makes fools of us all. A man in debt, with creditors at his heels, might act without thinking things through. And Mr. Crane, I suspect, is such a man." She recalled Mrs. Lumley's account of Victor's bulging suitcase, the urgent letters to London, and his restless pacing at the inn. Each detail, like a stitch, pointed to a man pressed by need. Victor Crane arrived at the hall within the hour, his thin frame slouched, his eyes darting nervously as he took a seat. The air seemed to thicken with his presence, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles pale. Slack, wasting no time, leaned forward. "Mr. Crane," he said, his voice sharp, "we've had word from a London pawnbroker. A man matching your description tried to sell a ring this morning. A ring remarkably like Miss Wentworth's. Care to explain?" Victor's face drained of colour, his lips parting in a silent gasp. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been here, in the village. I haven't been to London since I arrived." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple, and she saw a flash of panic, quickly masked by a forced calm. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. "It's a curious thing, Mr. Crane," she said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "How quickly news travels. A train to London and back is easily managed in a morning, especially for a man in a hurry. And you were in a hurry, weren't you? Those letters to the pawnbroker, the ones Miss Hartnell mentioned, urgent matters, I presume." Her words were soft, but they carried a weight that made Victor's shoulders hunch. "I sent no letters," he said, his voice rising. "And I didn't try to sell any ring. This is nonsense." His hands trembled now, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to the door, as if calculating his chances of escape. Constable Slack leaned closer, his notebook forgotten. "You were seen, Crane," he said. "The pawnbroker described you to a T, right down to that shabby suit of yours. Where's the ring? Hand it over, and we'll go easier on you." Victor's face twisted, a mix of fear and defiance. "I don't have it," he said, his voice cracking. "I swear, I don't know anything about it." But his eyes betrayed him, flickering with a desperation that Miss Marple recognized from her years of observing human frailty. She thought of her nephew Raymond's tales of London's underbelly, where men like Victor, drowning in debt, turned to desperate measures. She recalled, too, a village incident years ago, when a young man, pressed by creditors, had pilfered a silver watch from a neighbour, only to be caught when he tried to sell it. Victor's attempt to pawn the ring so soon after the theft suggested a man acting on impulse, not cunning. Yet the ring's whereabouts remained a mystery, and Miss Marple's mind turned over the possibilities, hidden in his lodgings perhaps, or discarded in a moment of panic. "Mr. Crane," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "you were at the wedding, seated close to the altar. A man in need, as you seem to be, might notice a ring left unattended, especially during a hymn when all eyes are elsewhere. It's a small act, isn't it, to slip something into a pocket?" Her tone was almost sympathetic, but her eyes were unyielding, watching for the smallest tell. Victor's hands clenched, and he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I've had enough of this," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm no thief. You've no proof." He turned to leave, but Slack's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "Not so fast," the constable said. "You're staying put until we search your lodgings. If that ring's there, we'll find it." Miss Marple rose, her shawl adjusted with care. "A search is wise, Mr. Slack," she said. "But let us be thorough. Mr. Crane's distress suggests he knows more than he says, but the truth, I find, often lies in the details." Her words were calm, but her mind was racing, piecing together the pawnbroker's account, Victor's panic, and the fleeting moment at the altar when the ring had vanished. As Slack escorted Victor to the Blue Boar Inn, Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her umbrella raised against the returning drizzle. The village, bathed in the soft light of late afternoon, seemed to watch in silence, its secrets waiting to be unravelled. Victor Crane, she was certain, held the key to the mystery, but whether he still had the ring, or why he had taken it, remained to be seen. Her needles tucked safely in her bag would wait, as would she, for the truth to emerge like a pattern from her knitting. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, its walls echoing with the ghosts of countless parish meetings, stood sombre under the gathering clouds of late afternoon. The air inside was thick with anticipation, the kind that precedes a storm. As Miss Jane Marple took her place in a corner chair, her knitting bag at her feet, her needles silent for now. The theft of Clara Wentworth's wedding ring had cast a long shadow over the village, and today, at Miss Marple's quiet suggestion, Constable Slack had summoned the 4 suspects, George Knightley, Lydia Gray, Reverend Hale, and Victor Crane, for a gathering that promised to unravel the mystery. Clara and Thomas sat near the front, their hands clasped, their faces taut with hope and dread. The hall's high windows admitted a grey light, casting faint shadows on the worn wooden floor, and Miss Marple's eyes, sharp beneath her modest hat, missed nothing. Constable Slack stood at the centre of the room, his notebook tucked under his arm, his expression one of grim determination. "We've got new information," he began, his voice carrying a note of authority. "A London pawnbroker saw a man matching Mr. Crane's description try to sell a ring matching Miss Wentworth's, gold, sapphire, engraved with CW. We're close to the truth, and I expect someone here knows more than they've said." His gaze swept the suspects, lingering on Victor, whose thin frame seemed to shrink under the scrutiny. Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap, spoke in a voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "It's a curious thing, isn't it?" she said, addressing the room, "how a single moment can change everything. A wedding, a hymn, a ring left on an altar, such small things, yet they reveal so much about us." Her words were soft, almost musing, but they carried a weight that stilled the room. George Knightley shifted in his seat, his hands tugging at his cuffs. Lydia Gray's lips tightened, her eyes fixed on the floor. Reverend Hale clasped his hands, his face pale, and Victor Crane's fingers twitched, his gaze darting to the door. She continued, her tone unchanged. "Let us consider that moment, the hymn, Love Divine, when all were standing, singing, their eyes on their hymnals. A moment when a hand, quick and unnoticed, could slip a ring from a cushion. It was a bold act, but a simple one, requiring only opportunity and nerve." Her eyes moved from one suspect to another, her expression one of quiet curiosity. "Mr. Knightley, you are at Mr. Harrow's side, close enough to reach the altar. Your debts, I'm told, have been pressing. Such burdens can cloud one's judgment, can they not?" George's face reddened, and he stood, his voice loud with indignation. "I've said it before, Miss Marple. I didn't touch the ring. I'd never betray Tom or Clara. Yes, I owe money, but I'm no thief." His hands clenched, and Miss Marple noted the desperation in his eyes, the way his protest carried both anger and fear. She nodded, her gaze shifting to Lydia. "And Miss Grey, you attending to Clara's veil, your hands busy, but your eyes free to wander. You've known Clara all your life, shared her joys and sorrows, yet your own sorrows, I fear, have been heavy lately. A broken engagement leaves marks, doesn't it? A ring, a symbol of another's happiness, might stir feelings best left buried." Lydia's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "That's cruel, Miss Marple," she said, her voice sharp but trembling. "I love Clara like a sister. I'd never hurt her, not for anything." Her hands twisted in her lap, and Miss Marple saw the glint of tears, quickly blinked away, a sign of pride warring with pain. Miss Marple turned to Reverend Hale, her voice softening further. "Reverend, you handled the ring, placed it on the cushion with care. The church's needs are no secret. Roofs leak, organs falter, and such burdens weigh heavily on a man of duty. A moment's temptation, perhaps, to ease that weight." Her words were gentle, almost apologetic, but they struck a chord, and Reverend Hale's face paled further. "I swear before God," he said, his voice low but firm, "I took nothing. The church's troubles are mine to bear, but I would never stoop to theft." His hands trembled slightly, and Miss Marple noted the sincerity in his eyes, though shadowed by a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights. Finally, her gaze settled on Victor Crane, whose fingers now gripped the arms of his chair, his face ashen. "Mr. Crane," she said, her tone unchanged, "you were a stranger to most at the wedding, seated close to the altar, your presence a puzzle. The pawnbroker's account places the ring in your hands this very morning. A man in debt, with creditors pressing, might see a ring as a way out, mightn't he? A quick act during the hymn, a pocket to hide it, a train to London to sell it." Her words hung in the air, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Victor stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is nonsense!" he cried, his voice cracking. "I didn't take the ring. I wasn't in London. You've no proof." His eyes darted wildly, and Miss Marple saw the panic in them, the look of a man cornered by his own actions. Constable Slack stepped forward, his voice sharp. "We've proof enough, Crane. The pawnbroker described you, your suit, your manner, everything. And we'll search your lodgings again, top to bottom. Where's the ring?" Victor's shoulders slumped, and he sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face. The room was silent, save for Clara's soft gasp and Thomas's muttered curse. Miss Marple's eyes remained on Victor, her mind weaving the final threads. She thought of her nephew Raymond's tales of men driven to ruin by debt, their lives unravelling in a single reckless act. Victor's attempt to pawn the ring so soon after the theft spoke of desperation, not cunning, but the ring's whereabouts remained a question. "Mr. Crane," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "you need not fear the truth. It has a way of setting things right, even when it's painful. Tell us where the ring is, and perhaps we can help you." Her words were kind, almost maternal, but they carried an unyielding resolve. Victor's hands dropped, and his eyes met hers, filled with a mix of fear and resignation. The room waited, the air heavy with the weight of what was to come. Chapter 11. The Confession. The village hall, bathed in the dim light of a cloudy afternoon, seemed to hold its breath as Victor Crane sat slumped in his chair, his thin hands covering his face, his shoulders trembling under the weight of Miss Jane Marple's gentle but unrelenting gaze. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and the faint dampness of the day's earlier rain. And the gathered group, Constable Slack, Clara Wentworth, Thomas Harrow, George Knightley, Lydia Gray and Reverend Hale, watched in tense silence. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her corner, her knitting bag untouched at her feet, observed Victor with the calm certainty of one who had seen human nature unravel many times before. Her words, soft yet piercing, lingered in the room. "Tell us where the ring is, and perhaps we can help you." Victor's hands fell slowly, revealing a face pale and drawn, his dark eyes glistening with unshed tears. He looked at Miss Marple, then at the others, his gaze settling briefly on Clara, whose expression held a mix of hope and heartbreak. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, cracked with the strain of confession. I took the ring." A gasp broke the silence, Clara's hand flying to her mouth, Thomas's jaw tightening as he leaned forward. George Knightley's eyes widened, while Lydia Gray's lips parted in a silent breath, her hands clenching in her lap. Reverend Hale bowed his head, as if in prayer, and Constable Slack stepped closer, his notebook already open, his face grim with triumph. Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, her eyes steady, though inwardly she felt a quiet satisfaction, like the completion of a difficult stitch in her knitting. "Go on, Mr. Crane," she said, her voice as gentle as a lullaby. "Tell us everything. The truth, I find, is always the best place to start." Victor swallowed hard, his hands twisting together as he spoke. "I'm in debt," he said, his voice shaking. "My shop in London, it's failing. Creditors were at my door, threatening to take everything. I came to St. Mary Mead because I thought I could start fresh, maybe ask Thomas for help, seeing as we're kin, however distant." He glanced at Thomas, who stared back, his face a mask of betrayal. "But you didn't ask for help," Miss Marple prompted, her tone encouraging but firm. "You saw the ring instead, didn't you?" Victor nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. "At the wedding, during the hymn, everyone was singing, looking at their books. The ring was just there, on the cushion shining. I was in the third pew, close enough to reach it. I didn't plan it. It just happened. I slipped it into my pocket, thinking no one would notice in the moment." His voice broke, and he rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. "I thought I could pawn it in London, clear my debts, and be gone before anyone knew." Clara's tears spilled over, and Thomas's arm tightened around her, his voice low and furious. "You stole from us, on our wedding day." His words cut through the room, and Victor flinched, his shoulders hunching further. Constable Slack, his pencil scratching furiously, interjected. "You tried to sell it this morning, didn't you? The pawnbroker turned you away. Where's the ring now, Crane?" Victor's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "I didn't sell it," he said quickly. "The pawnbroker wouldn't take it. He saw the engraving, asked too many questions. I got scared and came back. It's in my room at the Blue Boar, hidden in my suitcase, under the lining." His voice was barely audible now, and he looked at Clara, his expression pleading. "I'm sorry, Miss Wentworth. I was desperate. I didn't think it would hurt so much." Clara's sob broke the silence, and Thomas pulled her closer, his eyes never leaving Victor. "You thought stealing her grandmother's ring wouldn't hurt," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You've ruined our day, our trust, everything." Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture small but commanding attention. "Mr. Harrow," she said softly, "anger is understandable, but let us hear him out. Desperation, you see, can drive even a good man to folly." Her eyes returned to Victor, encouraging him to continue. Victor's voice steadied, though his hands still trembled. "I knew it was wrong the moment I took it," he said. "On the train to London, I kept thinking of Clara, of what it meant to her. But I was so afraid. My creditors, they've threatened to ruin me, to take my shop, my home. I thought the ring could buy me time." He looked at Miss Marple, as if seeking absolution. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't see another way." Constable Slack snapped his notebook shut, his face set. "That's enough," he said. "We'll fetch the ring from your room, Crane, and you'll be answering to more than just us." He turned to a young constable at the door, issuing orders to search the Blue Boar Inn. Miss Marple's mind turned over Victor's words, her thoughts weaving the final threads of the mystery. She recalled her nephew Raymond's stories of men driven to ruin by debt, their lives unravelling in a single reckless act. Victor's confession, raw and unpolished, rang true, but it was his panic at the pawnbroker's refusal that intrigued her most. A man less desperate might have planned better, chosen a less traceable path. Victor's haste, his clumsiness, spoke of a mind clouded by fear. She thought, too, of the other suspects, now cleared by Victor's admission. George Knightley's debts, Lydia Gray's envy, Reverend Hale's burdens. Each had seemed a plausible motive, yet none had acted. Human nature, she mused, was a tangle of possibilities, and it was the small details, the pawnbroker's description, Victor's nervous glances, that had pointed to the truth. As the young constable returned, breathless, with a small velvet pouch in hand, Clara gasped, her hands reaching out. Slack opened the pouch, revealing the gold ring with its sapphire. Initials C.W. gleaming faintly inside. Clara's tears flowed freely now, a mix of relief and lingering pain, and Thomas took the ring, his fingers trembling as he slipped it into his pocket. "You've got it back," Victor said, his voice hollow. "I know it doesn't fix things, but I'm sorry." His eyes met Clara's and she nodded, though her face remained shadowed with hurt. Miss Marple rose, her shawl adjusted with care. "Mr. Crane," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you've done right to tell the truth. It's a start, you know, toward mending what's broken. St. Mary Mead is a small place, but it has a way of forgiving, if one is honest." Her words were kind, but her eyes held a quiet warning, a reminder that actions carried consequences. Constable Slack motioned for Victor to stand, his voice brisk. "You'll come with me, Crane. We've got more to discuss at the station." Victor rose, his movements slow, as if the weight of his confession had drained him. As the room emptied, Clara clung to Thomas, the ring now a bittersweet symbol of their day. Miss Marple watched them go, her mind already turning to the village's healing. She thought of her garden, where a broken stem could sometimes be mended with care, and of human hearts, which, with time, could find their way back to trust. The truth, as she had promised, had come to light, and St. Mary Mead would soon settle back into its quiet rhythm. Chapter 12. The Restored Joy. The morning sun broke over St. Mary Mead with a clarity that seemed to wash away the shadows of the past days. The village, stirring from its unease, buzzed with a cautious optimism, as preparations were made to resume Clara Wentworth and Thomas Harrow's wedding ceremony. St. Edmund's Church, its roses still blooming despite the recent turmoil, stood ready to host the delayed vows, its stone walls warmed by the light streaming through the stained glass windows. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar pew near the back, adjusted her lace shawl and observed the gathering with her quiet, discerning gaze. Her knitting bag rested at her side, untouched for now, as she took in the scene, her mind reflecting on the resolution of the mystery that had briefly disrupted the village's peace. Clara stood at the altar once more, her ivory gown as radiant as before, though her eyes carried a new depth, a mix of relief and lingering vulnerability. Thomas, beside her, held her hand with a tenderness that spoke of their shared ordeal, his face alight with a determined joy. The ring recovered from Victor Crane's suitcase at the Blue Boar Inn gleamed on Clara's finger, its sapphire catching the morning light like a promise renewed. The congregation, smaller now but no less warm, filled the pews with familiar faces: Mrs. Bantry, Miss Hartnell, Mr. Ellis, each offering smiles of encouragement, their whispers of scandal replaced by murmurs of goodwill. Reverend Hale, his robes crisp and his demeanour steadier than it had been, stood before the couple, his prayer book open to the familiar words of the marriage service. Miss Marple noted the lift in his shoulders, the absence of the weariness that had clouded his eyes during the investigation. The church's burdens remained, but the restoration of the ring seemed to have lightened his spirit, as if the village's trust had been reaffirmed. George Knightley, standing again as best man, wore a subdued smile, his usual charm tempered by a humility born of the accusations he had faced. Lydia Gray, as maid of honour, adjusted Clara's veil with a gentleness that spoke of reconciliation, her face softer now, free of the tension that had marked her earlier. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the altar, where the velvet cushion, once the stage for a theft, now lay empty, its role fulfilled. She thought of Victor Crane, now in the custody of Constable Slack, his confession a weight lifted, but a price yet to be paid. His desperation, she mused, was not unlike that of others she had known in St. Mary Mead, a farmer driven to sell a neighbour's tools, a maid tempted by a silver spoon, each act a cry for relief from a life pressed too hard by circumstance. Victor's fate, she knew, would be decided by the law, but she hoped the village's forgiving spirit might offer him a path to redemption. The ceremony began, Reverend Hale's voice steady and warm as he spoke of love and commitment. Clara and Thomas exchanged vows, their words clear and heartfelt, and when the moment came for the ring, Thomas slipped it onto Clara's finger with a reverence that hushed the congregation. Miss Marple's lips curved in a quiet smile, her heart warmed by the sight. She thought of her garden, where a rose, once bruised, could bloom again with care, and of human hearts, which could mend with time and trust. As the couple kissed, the church erupted in applause, a release of the tension that had gripped St. Mary Mead. The organ swelled, its notes no longer wheezing, and the congregation rose, their faces bright with shared joy. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment, her eyes scanning the crowd, noting the small gestures, the way Mrs. Bantry dabbed her eyes, the way Miss Hartnell nodded approvingly, the way young Tommy Pierce grinned from the back pew. The village, she knew, had weathered this storm, as it had so many others, its resilience rooted in its closeness. Outside, as the couple emerged into the sunlight, the church bells rang, their peals echoing across the village green. Miss Marple followed at her own pace, her shawl adjusted with care, and joined the gathering at the church gate, where Clara and Thomas were showered with rice and good wishes. Clara, catching sight of Miss Marple, broke away to approach her, her eyes shining. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude, "we owe you so much. You found the ring. You brought it back to us." Miss Marple shook her head, her smile gentle. "Oh, my dear," she said, "I only listened and watched as I always do. The truth has a way of showing itself, if one is patient." She patted Clara's hand, her touch warm and reassuring, and turned to Thomas, who nodded his thanks, his earlier anger softened by relief. As the crowd moved toward the village hall for a modest reception, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze drifting to the horizon, where the hills of St. Mary Mead rolled gently under the clear sky. She thought of Victor Crane, whose desperation had led to a moment of folly, and of the others, George, Lydia, Reverend Hale, whose own struggles had been laid bare by the theft. Human nature, she reflected, was a complex weave, full of flaws and hopes, and it was in understanding those flaws that one found the path to forgiveness. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her parlour, her knitting bag open once more. The needles resumed their rhythm, each stitch a meditation on the village she loved. The bells continued to ring, their sound a reminder that St. Mary Mead, for all its mysteries, would always find its way back to peace. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, would be there, watching until the next puzzle called her to unravel it.